speakers, we have two. We have Dr. Godson and Dr. Joanna Brück. Now, Lisa is a lecturer in design history and material culture in NCAD here in Dublin, and she's had numerous publications which include The Secret Lives of Objects, How the Crowd Felt, Public Ceremony in the Irish Free State, and Making 1916, which was co-edited with her colleague Joanna Brück. She's also been funded by the Irish Research Council for a project called Making Memory, which is visual and material culture of commemoration in Ireland since 1800. Now, Joanna. Joanna is a reader in archaeology in the University of Bristol. She holds a BA and a PhD in archaeology from the University of Cambridge. And before moving to Bristol, she was senior lecturer in archaeology in UCD. Her primary area of research is the British Bronze Age, but she's also interested in historical archaeology, which includes Victorian and Edwardian public parks, and internment camp craftwork from 1916 to 1923. So maybe we put our hands together for Dr.
Okay, thanks, Maeve. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. And thanks everyone for coming. So almost 3 years ago now, Joe and I organised a conference called Making 1916, which resulted in a book that you see on the screen there, which contains, I think, 24 essays on a number of aspects of the material culture of the 1916 Rising, from photographs of the widows and children left behind, an essay by Orla Fitzpatrick, to an essay on the treatment of the physical remains of revolutionary sites by Damien Shields. So we're going to start with some introductory remarks about the usefulness of material culture as a way of understanding the 1916 Rising, and then talk about some of the contributions to the book, and then focus on our own research at the end, so our own kind of essays in the book. So I suppose Joe and I came together because both of us research and write about material culture, even though both of us have very different backgrounds and often very different research interests. So, for example, I'm currently researching the history of gynecological instruments in Ireland, so I thought I'd mention that given the setting. And Joe is working on aspects of prehistoric material culture, including items that might normally be considered as objects, such as fossils found in Bronze Age burials. However, we both share this interest, this research interest in material culture. So I suppose material culture, sometimes people think it sounds like a complex term, but it's very simple. It's just simply the relationship that people have with things. So our definition of material culture in the conference and in the book and in our own work includes not only things in terms of three-dimensional objects, but also the ways people interact with space, for example, through rituals, or also even bodies themselves, the way people might move or kind of compose themselves at particular kind of historical moments. So we decided to do this project, Making 1916, partly because we felt that material culture provides a very different way of understanding the Rising from the typical kind of political approach. And I think when we started 3 years ago, it was before the Joe Duffy book, it was before maybe so much focus on the everyday experience of the Rising. And we felt that there was a bit of a gap between between the analysis of academic historians and then popular imagination and experience, where the Rising, I suppose, is often evoked in terms other than political or military strategy. So we were interested not only in the materiality of the Rising as it happened during that week, but also the ways 1916 has been experienced, remembered, and imagined through things, through material culture, and maybe outside political debate. So, for example, you might recognise the left-hand side. We were considering, for example, the physical evidence of the Rising that forms part of the backdrop to daily life in Dublin. And there's a fair few archaeologists have contributed to the book which actually look at that, such as the blast wounds on the facade of this building, and then as I said, we were kind of interested in how 1916 is imagined, maybe. So that's an Easter card on the right-hand side, made by my 7-year-old daughter, actually, last week. And as you can see in her imagination and what she can kind of glean about the history of the 1916 Rising, she's imagining bullet holes in the columns outside the GPO. And the Easter Bunny, of course, is there as well. Right. So we also thought about how everyday objects associated with the Rising became changed utterly and given a very different agency from when they were first designed or made. So this is, I think, particularly relevant in terms of an insurrection involving street fighting and improvisation rather than maybe a fully equipped official army. So this can be seen very directly with the weaponizing of everyday objects, as with the tins turned into bombs that you see replicas of in the exhibition upstairs, and you can see on the right there of the screen, or as Jane Tynan writes about in the book, homemade uniforms. So a lot of the those participating in the Rising kind of made an approximation of a military uniform, again, because it was an insurrection rather than necessarily an official war, or just by dint of association with particular sites, such as this door handle from the GPO, kind of made special because it's from Easter week 1916, as you can see through the label. And then, of course, these kind of objects of memory that are almost just involuntary kind of witnesses, join more officially designed and designated commemorative material culture, such as this memorial card of a child killed in action in Easter week. So, and then on the right-hand side, the medal given to those who participated. Okay. So as we've seen more recently, there's a wealth of objects and images surviving from the Rising, as well as from later events that commemorated it in museums and archives, as part of the streetscape and in private ownership. And these range from the objects we've just seen there, and really from the informal to the formal. So buttons cut off from the tunics of volunteers, photographs of the ruined GPO, and objects looted during Easter week. Whether or not a porter gets the blame for them. That very sad story upstairs. And I suppose Joe and I felt that the objects of the Rising are really key to the construction of both personal and official memories of the event. So our book really explores what material culture then can tell us about the varied perceptions and experiences of this kind of really seminal moment in national consciousness, as well as the changing ways it's been drawn into political debates and public spectacle over the course of the last century. So Joe's going to talk us through the 4 sections of the book that address different themes. Yeah.
So one clear way of understanding the Rising through objects and material culture is by looking at artifacts and spaces that were physically part of and active agents of the Rising in 1916. Much of this research into actual objects might involve redressing certain mythologies and understanding how particular artifacts turned into icons. So, for example, the artist Brian Hand, in his study in our book, addresses ways of reading one of the most iconic objects of 1916, the Irish tricolour, hoisted by Sean Connolly on the roof of City Hall on Easter Monday, and analysed by Brian in relation to the Republican French and Italian flags, and, in particular, Chartist and suffragette flags. Brian makes the point that in 1916, the tricolour would have been most recognisable as a suffragette emblem, suggesting new ways of understanding how the green, white and orange tricolour would have been viewed. The contributions to our section, The Effective Bonds of the Rising, address the emotive power of objects, a key concern in material culture studies. We felt that any understanding of the objects of the Rising needed to address the ways objects and images worked and were worked on to sustain and transform the relationships and social identities of those involved in the Rising. Our contributor Jack Elliott explores how individuals used images from newspapers, postcards, and other sources in creative ways to make their own personal mementos of the dead and to display their allegiance to the ideals for which the 1916 leaders had died, as with this example of homemade lockets featuring newspaper photographs of 1916 leaders that forms part of the 1916 collection in Kilmainham Jail. In these two examples, then, the objects analysed help us to trace the change in public opinion between 1916 and 1917 and demonstrate the power of objects and images, especially those of the dead leaders and the families they'd left behind. In our section, Revivalism and the Rising, the contributors were concerned with cultures of revival, the deliberate recasting of certain material objects or acts from the past. Case studies suggest that revival often works to assert a reimagining not only of the past, but to enable its active use and resonance in the present day. One particularly intriguing aspect in terms of objects in 1916 relates to Irish national revival clothing. The dress historian Hilary O'Kelly traces the visible and significant role Celtic revival dress played in how Irishness was reimagined and embodied before 1916. For example, as seen here in the image of Tomás McDonagh and his family in 1913. O'Kelly explains how the fallout from the Rising meant that the same dress that once exemplified idealistic hopes of a lost identity elicited markedly divergent responses afterwards, driving some formerly apathetic citizens into national fervour, while turning the once impassioned towards a more practical modernity, as in this image on the right of Michael Collins, where the kilt once worn by revolutionaries is now confined to musicians and children. Remembering the Rising is, of course, something that we're all doing at the moment, and in our section on this, we looked at how objects and material culture are clearly central to how Easter 1916 has been forged and represented, what is brought to attention, what is maintained, what is forgotten, to how the materiality of the event has been used to create different narratives. One key agent in this has been museums. Joye and Brenda Malone have researched the creation of the 1916 collections and exhibitions at the National Museum of Ireland. They explore how, over the years, the different exhibitions have reflected changing understandings both of the Rising and of the role of a national museum, drawing out the tension of different curatorial approaches and demonstrating the power of everyday objects that, due to their association with Easter 1916, had become relics. So to you again.
Okay. I'm just going to pick up my phone. Sorry. Okay, so as I said at the start, Joe and I are going to focus on the two essays that we individually wrote, rather than trying to give 3 lines on everyone. So, my essay in the book looks at cultural memory and the commemoration of 1916 in the early years of the Free State. So in terms of material culture, it doesn't focus so much on objects, but ritual and attitudes to the bodies of the dead. In this case, the executed leaders and their burial site in Arbor Hill. And I suppose I was really looking at how ceremonies of remembrance were used often to political ends and were understood in different ways by different factions. So this is Arbor Hill now, which you all know where Arbor Hill is? Yeah, great. The back of Collins Barracks, yeah. And then this should fade into Arbor Hill in the Ordnance Survey map of 1897 to 1913, so roughly what it would have been like in 1916 and subsequent the 20s and 30s. So in terms of how 1916 was commemorated in the earliest years of the state's existence, I want to look in particular at this site, Arbor Hill Prison. It was first opened as a military prison or detention barracks in 1848, and in 1916 the site included the prison with adjoining yards, the Church of the Sacred Heart, and an old military cemetery. I'm obsessed with ceremony, sorry. Among the prisoners detained there during the War of Independence was Joseph Lawless, and in his extensive witness statement to the Bureau of Military History, he recounts how, in early 1921, the severe overcrowding in the prison meant there was no room for exercise in the immediately adjoining yard. Instead, prisoners were allowed access to an outer yard, I think what's marked as parade ground there. Lawless says that, probably through a whisper from one of the British NCOs, they learned the precise spot in the northeast corner where 14 of the executed 1916 leaders had been buried in a trench almost 5 years previously, although the ground showed no sign whatever that any grave existed. The bodies had been buried uncoffined in a quicklime pit in Arbour Hill after the executions in Kilmainham Jail, through the orders of the military governor, General Maxwell. He refused the release of the remains to the bereaved families and wrote in a letter to the Prime Minister, Asquith, that otherwise Irish sentimentality would turn the graves into martyrs' shrines, and annual processions would be made to them, which will cause constant irritation in this country. So if we look at the history of nationalist and republican ritual, Maxwell had a point. Over the 19th century and up to 1916, funerals, processions and graves were key focal points for nationalist ceremony and political action. But by denying a tangible materiality or visibility to the leaders' graves, Maxwell tried to ensure that they couldn't be made sacred and couldn't be activated, I suppose, as sites of sedition or pilgrimage. However, in his statement, Lawless recounts how, within a day or two of discovering its location, prisoners started gathering at the burial site of the dead leaders to recite the rosary each day for the repose of their souls and for the triumph of the cause for which they had died. As such, although the grave was invisible, we can see through these first kind of very small-scale ritual, ceremonial actions at the site, the gestures, utterances and prayers of the prisoners, that the grave became materialised in some way. So that's what I mean by ritual being a form of material culture. Anyway, so Lawless tells us that the praying at the invisible grave was looked upon by the prison authorities as a political demonstration, and after a few days the prisoners were banned from entering the outer yard. When the Free State came into existence in 1922, the grave at Arbour Hill became more fully realised as a ritual site. And I suppose it's important to note that this was in the dying days of the Civil War, and less than a month after the National Army had been involved in the notorious atrocity in Ballyseedy in County Kerry, when Republican prisoners had been tied to a landmine and blown up. So just a few weeks later, on May 3rd, 1923, a ceremony was held at Arbour Hill. And May the 3rd was the anniversary of the execution of Pádraig Pearse, Thomas Clarke and Thomas MacDonagh, so three of the main leaders of the Rising. A newspaper account in the Freeman's Journal tells us that early in the morning, a parade of more than 1,000 troops marched the short distance from Collins Barracks, with bands playing the Dead March, to the Garrison Church at Arbour Hill for solemn requiem mass, where they were joined by the President of the Executive Council, members of the government and armed forces. Afterwards, the soldiers marched to the yard where the bodies had been buried and where the grave site was by now marked by a small cross. So that's all that marked the grave at that stage. They said a decade of the Rosary in Irish fired 3 volleys over the grave and buglers sounded the last post. Through its timing and form, the ceremony's identity as a commemoration of the action of the Rising was ambiguous. And I suppose this is a question everyone keeps asking at the moment: why are we celebrating it not on the date? Rather than being associated with the dates of the Rising, so April 24th onwards, or the movable feast of Easter, in fact, it aligned remembrance to the deaths of the leaders. Its central commemorative ceremony was a Requiem anniversary mass. So, this is a little bit later on, 1920s. Newspaper reports described the commemorations in May 1923 in terms of the National Army paying tribute to mourning and laying claim to its dead. The Irish Independent described the men in front of the leaders' graves as the direct descendants of the 1916 martyrs, describing them as rigid ranks of soldiers clad in the uniform the men they honoured had sanctified with their blood. However, that same army were considered traitors to the ideals of 1916 by Republicans, as they represented a compromise, a free state with dominion status, rather than the virtual republic proclaimed in 1916 by the men whose graves they supposedly were mourning over. So other than for those present, the ceremonies had to be described in words, as it was a private event with the chief mourners, the army. Rituals of remembrance are usually described by historians in relation to how they justify present-day aspirations, with foundation or origin myths being particularly important. This seems to be the case in the early years of Arbor Hill as a ceremonial space. While the rituals were very formal and very fixed in terms of their actual kind of expression, they were represented and spoken about in terms that suggested that the pro-treaty side and the state itself derived their moral and military authority from the martyrs of 1916. And even though this was the first commemoration, they already the event was already being historicised. So the Freeman's Journal said it is probable that yesterday's ceremony will be an annual one, so kind of almost inaugurating it as the commemorative ceremony of 1916 by the state. And so it proved, with the format fixed from the first occasion of invitation-only mass, followed by prayers at the grave. And in subsequent years, the gates of Arbor Hill creaked open slightly to admit by invitation the relatives of those who fell in action in 1916. So they were all invited. But most of them stayed away, including almost everyone whose family member was buried there. So this is the grave of people's brothers or sons or husbands, and yet the families kind of refused to go and see the graves because of the Civil War divisions. Okay. So I suppose the Civil War, in a way, had fractured a kind of collective memory of 1916, and the state's control of the graves of the leaders, in effect, kind of prohibited mourning at the very place and by the very people that maybe it meant the most to on a personal level. So this kind of official commemoration in May was always then in contrast with the unofficial kind of annual Republican parades to Glasnevin Cemetery, where even though the executed leaders weren't actually buried, was seen as had the Republican plot, and since the 19th century was seen as kind of where Irish patriots were most typically buried. Okay, so from 1925 then, the general public were allowed to visit the graves following the formal ceremonies at Arbor Hill, and it became more permanently marked as a kind of ritual site of remembrance. So this is from a stained glass window inserted in the wall of the church, bearing a dedication to the men who had died for Ireland. Inil, Cuivne, Navarre, a Furbos, their son Naharan. And then the graves were now fenced off by a little railing, as you can see there, by a low railing. But at this stage, there was still no individual names on the mass grave, and also the relatives of those buried there were still absent. So the significance really of Arbor Hill at this stage was public ceremony rather than private mourning. And I think, didn't think that was going to come up so soon. Okay, when De Valera's Fianna Fáil got into power in 1932, Kathleen Clark, whose husband Tom and brother Ned Daly were buried in Arbor Hill, wrote that she had never seen those graves, so she'd never seen her husband or her brother's grave, and never intended to visit them on a permit from any source. From 1933, Fianna Fáil publicly extended the invitation to the annual anniversary ceremonies to the relatives of all the irregulars executed during the Civil War. So as we can see from this, or well, maybe you can't see it too clearly, but from this list of invitees from 1933, and these are of people executed obviously by the pro-treaty side during the Civil War. None of them were actually, it says, date and place of execution, name, date and place of execution, and then where buried. None of them were buried in Arbor Hill, and yet we have these kind of requiem mass on the anniversary of some of those buried there. So we've got this kind of funny slippage between the actual materiality of the bodies there as a gravesite, and then it becomes this kind of just general kind of ceremonial site. So despite the supposed reverence for graves amongst Irish nationalists, The material culture of Arbor Hill, the ceremonies and graves there, distorted the typical collective acts of memory, of both collective mourning and of commemoration. Okay, I'm going to skip that bit maybe. Okay, well, I will mention it. Yeah, okay. Okay, and just to suggest that maybe one of the reasons that the commemoration in the early years of the state was so fixed on the idea of the requiem mass, I think is partly because the state's legitimacy was still kind of under threat. People were questioning its right to exist because it wasn't a full republic and because of what had happened during the Civil War. And the use of religious ceremony in some ways seemed to almost make the state seem more respectable, and certainly to legitimize it and even to kind of almost baptize it in some way. So, for example, the Irish tricolour was, officially blessed by the Archbishop of Dublin, as in this painting by Sir John Lavery. And in some ways, it was religious anniversaries that were more fully celebrated and that could be more fully celebrated rather than necessarily kind of secular nationalist ones, at least officially by the government. So, for example, you've got the centenary of Catholic emancipation in 1929, where there's, 500,000 people attend open-air mass in the Phoenix Park. And a lot of the kind of rhetoric around this is about this was the birth of the nation, 1829. So what we think of as maybe the birth of the nation, or what's being represented now, is 1916. Because it was too contentious for the government at the time to really lay claim to 1916, we have this kind of almost substitution of an alternative foundation myth found in religion. So, and the idea that religion could be a unifying force. This is a quote from the Minister for External Affairs at the time of the centenary of Catholic emancipation, and he says, "I hope every citizen of this state, no matter what otherwise his views may be, will regard this event in its true perspective, detached from the passing quarrels and jealousies of our time." So I suppose that's kind of trying to suggest that religion could transcend these political divisions. And I think we see it pretty clearly here in a Dublin Opinion cartoon, 1926. I think this communicates really strongly the problem with kind of secular memory and attempting to have some kind of collective memory a decade after the 1916 Rising. And that's Kevin O'Higgins there. Okay.
So I did something very different topic in my paper, in the book. I was interested in looking at a craftwork made by internees in camps and prisons in the aftermath of the Easter Rising, but through then also to the end of the Civil War. And I was interested in how that helped the internees to cope with the social and psychological challenges of imprisonment. Making objects allowed internees to put order and meaning on the world and worked as an expression of intellectual freedom and personal capacity. Now, a very strong set of themes comes out when we look at this body of craftwork. Motifs that reference the antiquity of Irish culture are really predominant. Things like round towers, harps, Celtic interlace, they're all very, very common. And of course, those objects celebrate the achievements and sophistication of Gaelic Irish culture prior to the Norman conquest. But newer symbols were also important, notably the tricolour, and it's interesting that this is a symbol that only really kind of, becomes popularised, if you like, with the Rising, but already at Frongoch, the internment camp where people were sent in the immediate aftermath of the Rising, it's used repeatedly in working macrame objects, for example. Now, alongside kind of cultural nationalist imagery, the sort of nationalist symbols, there's a lot of use of religious imagery too. And this is interesting because despite the long history of Protestant involvement in cultural nationalism and the various independence movements over the 18th and 19th centuries, a growing ideological link was made between republicanism and Catholicism in the immediate wake of the Rising. And this is reflected in the specifically Catholic character of the religious imagery employed. So we see, for example, lots of holy water fonts, bone chalices surmounted by monstrances for the display of the host, the use of the IHS, for example, that you would have seen on contemporary Catholic gravestones, and so on. So these sorts of symbols are coming up again and again in different types of objects made by internees during this period. There's also a real interest in the passage of time and marking that. So the importance of remembering and commemoration, it's not something that's specific to today, but they're actually already interested in this as a theme in this period. And it's constantly revisited in internment camp craftwork. Almost a quarter of the objects that I looked at from my project were inscribed with both the camp name and the date, or creating souvenirs, I suppose, around which memories could be retraced and reordered. Inscribing an object with a date, of course, demonstrates an eye to the future, a commitment to survival and to life beyond and outside of the barbed wire, and of course also acts as a way of marking, bounding, and transcending the uncertain temporalities of internment. Craftwork also seems to have been brought home after prisoners were released. Objects such as the matching pair of bone harps made at Newbridge Camp, you can see one of them there on the top right-hand side of the slide, but there's another one too. These types of these particular objects were mounted on stands that are clearly later in date, and it's not hard to imagine them displayed on a mantelpiece. These sorts of items allowed experience to be authenticated and mythologized, memorializing the experience of internment and incorporating history and big historical events into private time and private personal experience and narrative. Craftwork was also frequently used to challenge authority and to subvert the norms of camp life. Camp issue material culture was turned to new ends. So, for example, spoons were made into Tara-style brooches at Tin Town and Hare Park. During the War of Independence, internees in camps such as Ballyconlar made rings and brooches from coins. The camp authorities actually banned this activity, which they viewed as a defacing of legal tender. In fact, there's a nice example up there on the top right-hand side, in this case from Spike Island, where a coin has been used to make a brooch, and they've carefully cut out the head of the king, which I quite like. But of course, prisoners found a way of working around those sorts of systems and rules. So one internee's wife, for example, baked a silver half-crown into a cake that she sent him at Ballyconlar so he could make her a brooch. Perhaps one of the most interesting or possibly curious features of craftwork from internment camps right across this period is the dominance of objects associated with women. Items like macrame ladies' handbags and brooches. And I love the style of the ladies' handbags because they're very kind of 1920s. I think that the production of these items allowed internees to address the ambiguities around the definition and performance of masculinity in the all-male context of the camp. In most camps, internees did their own washing, mending, cooking, cleaning, and this disruption of normative gender roles appears to have provoked a considerable degree of disquiet, a sense of uneasiness that's often addressed through humour. So you can see there this rather dishevelled-looking guy who says, "She can never say I didn't do any washing," but obviously he's not making a tremendously good job of it. The ambivalences of masculinity behind the wire were explored in plays, shows, and other events in which men took on female roles. Craftwork seems to have been co-opted into these discourses on the troublesome definition of masculinity. So you can see there on the top right-hand side a spoof ad in the Ballyconlar Camp magazine, which sought a principal boy and other well-shaped ladies for panto. Send waist measurements to this office. Bring own tights unless prepared to wear macrame mantle border as substitute. I have to say I have no idea how a macrame mantle border could substitute for tights, because they're probably quite different sorts of things. Ultimately, however, most craftwork was made to be sent out of the camps rather than to be used inside them. Objects were made by internees as gifts for friends and family in the outside world, particularly wives, mothers, sisters, and other female friends and admirers. Here, objects worked to ensure the continuity of effective bonds and familial relationships in the face of spatial and physical disruption. You can see the macrame bag. I don't know if you can read it, but it says Moher on it. So again, lovely Clo Gaelach, lovely kind of Celtic style script being used there. Alongside other decorative personal items like handbags and rings, internees also made a lot of objects associated with the home. And again, when I started looking at these collections, I was quite intrigued to see not only the number of handbags, but also the number of tea cozies that people were making. Things like tea cozies, mantle borders, woolwork, table centres, all speak of a poignant nostalgia for domesticity. Such objects provided male internees who, in most other ways, must have felt profoundly disempowered, with a continued sense of involvement and engagement in domestic and family life. The desire to exert continued control over the domestic domain as a means of emphasising the resilience and continuity of male power is, I think, really nicely illustrated by the set of macrame children's reins made at Frongach. And there you've got, to me, the kind of technology of knotting and binding and tying that's used to make these macrame objects is very much about relationships between an absent father and his child, but also that sense of trying to exert the continuity of male authority when, you know, a father has been forcibly displaced from his family, and he's obviously concerned about how his family is going to make ends meet, and I'm sure that must have challenged his sense of, you know, who he was as a man, if you think about, you know, sort of normative ideas about masculinity and power in the home and so on, that would have been, you know, usual in this cultural context in the early part of the 20th century. So that's my work, but just to conclude on what we have to say for tonight, we hope you'll have some questions afterwards. I think that one of the most noticeable features of the 2016 commemorations is the extent to which the public, the media and the academic community are interested in telling the story of 1916 from new and different perspectives. Jo Duffy's book, Lisa's mentioned it already, on the children who died in the Rising is of course part of that, as are the plans to commemorate members of the Dublin Metropolitan Police alongside volunteers and civilian casualties at Glasnevin Cemetery. In particular, there's an interest in personal histories and experience of the Rising that requires us to move beyond the big names and the politics of 1916 to speak of the impact of the Rising on ordinary people and their lives. Of course, material culture is a particularly rich source of information for this subject. Here, the power of objects lies not in their use as evidence, but as pivots around which different understandings of the Rising can be explored and discussed. The toffee axe, or indeed the cricket bat, featured on Brenda and Malone's great blog, which some of you may know, the cricket bat that died for Ireland. The toffee axe was stolen from a Dublin sweet shop in the looting that took place during Easter week. Now part of the National Museum's collections, it speaks eloquently of a wholly different but less easily celebrated aspect of the material culture of the Rising. Moreover, objects of a power that's often greater than the written word. Intimate, personal objects like the felt baby shoes made by Kathleen Clark while she was imprisoned in Holloway Jail, or James Connolly's bloodstained shirt, speak to us in a very particular and powerful way. The tactile immediacy of objects can therefore be used to engage the public with difficult histories. It's also worth considering now not only the material culture of the Rising from 1916, but from 2016 too. In the future, evidence for this, such as this Common Naman doll, or this project by school children, will hopefully speak of the formerly overlooked importance of women in 1916, and the encouragement of more creative approaches in understanding and remaking the Rising as the foundational myth of the nation. So, thank you very much.
So, would anyone have any questions or contributions? See who's standing.
Give them a minute. They'll think of something, hopefully.
Yes, okay.
Well, you mentioned about that cricket bat. What was the story? Could you just repeat what was the story behind that cricket bat?
The cricket bat was in Elvery's sport shop and took a bullet, basically.
It's just
it
where
was in the window.
Supermax is now.
Yeah.
Do you know where Supermax is on O'Connell Street? Yeah. That's where Elvery's was, you know, the sports supplies. And that was it, yeah.
It was
as Joe
in the
said,
window.
it was in the window. And it's in the National Museum's collection. Brenda Malone has written about it. And
It's a very good blog. The cricket bat that died for Ireland.
yeah,
So, you know,
but that's
if you're
what that's
interested
its
in curious
nickname in the
objects.
museum. That was
Yes.
its nickname in the museum.
Exactly.
It's in the and it has a bullet lodged in the front of it. But it's in their new exhibition of 1916.
Okay, well, I'll just say that. I'd like to say thank you. Oh, sorry.
So, where would you think we should go looking for objects? Like, obviously, you're talking about the National Museum in Kildare Street
Oh, Collins Barracks.
and Collins Barracks.
Hans Barks,
It's a really good exhibition. It's
Yeah.
great, actually. really
But I think there's lots and
There's
lots and
lots
lots of
around.
exhibitions
Yes, yeah, for sure.
all around the country at the moment on 1916. I mean, there's the GPO have opened their visitor centre now. Then the Sinn Féin are running an exhibition in the Ambassador. But the National Museum is really
Yeah.
where nearly
It's
every,
where-
where most things are. Like the GPO and the Ambassador, a lot of the objects are replicas. So it depends on whether you want to see the real object or not. And it's kind of funny why we do want to see the real object, like that's the actual whatever. So I think
Like a
in
relic.
terms of the power of
Relic.
objects, like
Yeah.
very simple kind of, yeah, sometimes.
Are there still any of the objects that would have been around, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago, which are archived? And the reason I'm asking is because an uncle of mine carved a Celtic cross out of a piece of corned beef bone. It used to be in Kildare Street and has vanished, and I've asked on a number of occasions in it.
And do you know which camp it was in?
From
And it was a cross or
a cross, a Celtic cross.
cross.
So like,
You
yeah.
should email me because I've seen, well, they got out everything that they had or they knew of when I was looking through their collections. And I can tell you at least whether I've seen it in their collections. So if you want to email me, you know.
Will do.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
if you tell me what your uncle's name was and
Yes, yeah,
give me
yeah.
any information you can, I can please tell you if I've seen it.
I just want to say, I think with 2016, a lot of people are, with the whole idea of looking back at the personal stories, people are finding stuff in their own attics and
Yeah, there's a big
you know,
road
under
show kind of, isn't
stairs
there?
and
Yeah.
so
Actually, go into that.
there's a whole movement of everything that we
yeah.
know already that's in the national museums and stuff. There's a whole huge area that's being brought to light that has never been seen before. Like there was my colleague in the Royal College of Physicians, just there on Kildare Street, emailed me through a photograph that a man had taken of this beautiful poem that was written by a 12-year-old that was here in the college during the Rising, Tommy Keenan. But he found it in a box that was in a corporation flat that was being emptied out. And he just took all the stuff and he went through it and found this poem. So there's all of these kind of things that they're hidden. But I think because people are so aware of the personal stories and like the children and things like that, that people are looking for them. And that's how I think huge amounts of material will come out that we didn't know existed,
Yeah.
which will be great. Yeah.
I think what's interesting about Brenda and Laura's essay and Pat Cook's essay in the book is that they're saying that the National Museum was actually very resistant to collecting objects to do with the Rising because I guess the director at the time was this German guy and he thought it was kind of a bit unseemly. These were just sentimental objects. They were only important because their association maybe with people, and often they're very ordinary, like James Connolly's hat. Well, just because it was his hat, why should the museum collect it when how could that sit beside, say, the Tower brooch or an Ogham stone or whatever? So they're kind of collected unofficially, and then form the basis of the history collection.
Yeah.
But a lot of them would only be deemed museum worthy because of who they're associated with or what they were associated with. So that's kind of interesting. It's the first time very ordinary 20th century objects are collected in Ireland in a museum, and it's because of their association with the Rising.
Okay, well I'd just like to say thank you very much to our two speakers for this evening.